Barth Patriots Beat podcast here on this Thursday afternoon. And today, Alex, we are going to break down the path for Mac Jones to become the week one starter for the New England Patriots, or we can just call it the starter in his rookie season as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be in week one, but we want to make it a little bit more exciting by putting that kind of onus on him to get that starting job at the end of training camp in the preseason. So we're going to talk a little bit of Mac Jones here at the beginning of the show. Then we're going to get into some of the stuff about N'Keal Harry, Jeremy Fowler having a report out there today about a conditional sixth round pick sort of being the price that's being floated around the league for N'Keal Harry right now. So we'll get into that later on. But I want to start with Mac Jones, Alex, and just how he wins this starting job in training camp. And we're not talking about Cam Newton getting injured or something like that. We're talking about him just outright winning the job and stealing it from Cam. And I wanted to drop this stat to start off, then we'll get into some of the sort of plan. I only had 2 steps for Mac instead of 3 like I had with Cam, but we can do sort of a similar setup. But the one stat I wanted to drop here was out of 33 quarterbacks drafted in the first round in the last decade, so that's since 2010, only one of those 33 quarterbacks didn't start a game in their rookie season, and that was Jake Locker way back when for the Tennessee Titans. So every other quarterback, now some of those guys like Patrick Mahomes started one game, and it was a week 17, that sort of situation. But most of these QBs that get drafted where Mac got drafted eventually start as rookies at some point in time, and a lot of them started double-digit games as rookies. So we're talking about a situation where eventually Mac is going to get his chance, whether it's early or it's late or it's this year or next year. The keys are going over to Mac Jones at some point in time, and history, at least recent history, tells us that it's going to be sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I just, and I've said this before, I think it's going to be later because history tells us this with the other 31 NFL teams. The Patriots generally don't operate like the other 31 NFL teams. So it's a good stat. It's an interesting stat. I think it is a little bit loaded, like you said, with guys with Mahomes who played one game, week 17, where, he was probably going up against a second team defense for most of it. So it's somewhat relevant, but you got and I'm a big context guy. I'm a big, let's look at what's happened in the past to see what's going to happen now. I just don't, again, there's some value to that, but I don't know that the Patriots are going to stick to the same plan that the rest of the league has used.
Yeah. And if you go back, really, this stat sort of what joined up the stat for me was some of the Aaron Rodgers stuff that's been out there, and there really isn't a ton of quarterbacks. And also, when you look at the situation in San Francisco with Trey Lance and Jimmy Garoppolo, it's not exactly the same situation, obviously, as Cam and Mac, but they have a similar position where they have a veteran quarterback who has a case to start football games this year, but they then drafted the guy high in the draft. And it's just not a ton of history of teams giving that veteran QB an extremely long leash. And Patrick Mahomes and Alex Smith in Kansas City is probably the only example, other than the Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers example, where you can come up with a quarterback that really was drafted in the first round that was really forced to sit by a veteran, right? Really, you are going to sit on the bench for an entire year. Mahomes and Alex Smith is really the only recent example of that happening. And as we get into this,
but then again, who were the 2 best quarterbacks in football last year? Patrick Mahomes and Aaron Rodgers, the 2 guys you just named. So, for what it's worth.
There's something
you could argue the 3rd best was Brady, who also sat for a year. And granted, that was, a generation ago, it feels like. But if you want to talk historical context, let's talk historical context.
Yeah, there's an argument both ways, I think, in terms of is it benefit a quarterback from sitting or not? I think a guy like Patrick Mahomes, who came into the league extremely raw, right? A guy that had a lot of really raw tools and upside, similarly to a guy like a Trey Lance in a lot of ways, where there's a ton of things that you have to look at that you might need to tweak or refine or alter a little bit to fit an NFL system. But a guy like Mac is not like that, right? Mac is a lot more polished, I would say. He doesn't have the physical upside of a Mahomes or a Lance, but he's a lot more polished than those 2 guys are in terms of his fundamentals and his technique in the pocket and things of that nature. And I already see that the people in the chat coming in against in defense of Cam Newton. We did a video last week, or a podcast, last week, with the same exact question for Cam Newton, right? So we're doing both quarterbacks here. Last week we did it for Cam. This week we're going to do it for Mac. So let's get into some of the things that I wrote down.
So can I just touch on something you just said real quick?
Yes.
About, the NFL readiness, because that's what makes this. That's the only thing that makes this a conversation, I think, right? If they had taken Trey Lance, if they'd taken any of, not Mac, not Lawrence, the other three guys, Lance, Wilson, and Fields, would we be having a debate? Maybe with Fields, we'd have a debate. If they had taken Lance or if they had taken Wilson, I think the consensus would be Cam's going to start for the year and they're going to redshirt that guy and they're going to do the Patrick Mahomes thing. The whole reason Mac Jones was a first-round pick was his NFL readiness. He doesn't necessarily have the ceiling of a first-round pick, certainly not of the other four guys in the draft class, but his NFL readiness, for him to be as ready for the NFL game at that age, is unprecedented. So that was the whole thing. He was a first-round pick because he was a plug-and-play guy. If he was anywhere else, if he goes to Chicago, right, of course he's starting over Andy Dalton. If he goes, to any of these other quarterback-needy teams, I think of course he's going to start right away. The Patriots are the only team, because of their historical hesitance to sit rookies, where we hold it up. And Mac Jones' NFL readiness makes him the only quarterback where we'll actually have this conversation of, could he start week one or early on for the Patriots as a rookie.
That's why I brought up the stat to begin with, was because I do think that most people are hesitant to say that Bill Belichick will play a rookie quarterback. Most people are hesitant to say that Mac, going up against a guy like Cam Newton with 10 years of experience in the league, is going to win the job. But at the same time, even though we have all of that evidence, the other overwhelming evidence is that if you get drafted in the top 15 as a QB in the first round, you're probably going to play, right? That's just what the history of the league tells us. And let's get into some of the ways that Mac can sort of win this job in practice, in training camp, in the preseason. And the number one thing that I wrote down is dominate the details, right? Because if Mac Jones gets into what I wrote down as sort of an athleticism contest with Cam Newton, right? Who's the best runner? Who's got the strongest arm? Who's the biggest guy? All these little, all these big picture things, right? If he gets into that kind of contest where Cam is running around, using his legs, throwing the ball deep, I don't think it's going to be an easy road for Mac Jones. I think Cam wins every single time if we're just going to get into that sort of foot race, if you will. But if Mac Jones can dominate the details, as in be the fastest through the progressions, understand pre-snap and control the line of scrimmage, ball placement, mechanics in the pocket, anticipation and timing, the little things. And these are the things that when we talked about Mac as a prospect coming in, that we liked so much about him, was that he was a quarterback that, okay, maybe on the surface, he didn't have all this athleticism and raw ability that some of these other guys come in having, like a Justin Fields, like a Trey Lance, but he is very, very good at the little details of quarterbacking. And I think that if he can continue to do that at the pro level and dominate those details in camp, we are going to see very quickly that his style of play and the way that he can control the line of scrimmage and handle the game mentally is going to fit a lot more with what Josh McDaniels is going to ask him to do than necessarily Cam Newton's style of play. And Mike Giardi had a really interesting quote from a player on the Patriots where he said, the player said, that Max sees the game the same way that Josh McDaniels sees the game. And I think that is the overarching theme of dominate the details, right? Just be that extension of the coaching staff.
And I mean, do you want to make your other points? Because I'm going to have the same take I've had. Why don't you make your points? Because I think I'm going to end up disagreeing with them.
Okay, so the second point is ball security, right? Because last year, Cam Newton threw a bunch of interceptions. I don't have the number right off the top of my head. I think it was 18 or something
12?
Like that. Was it 12?
Was it 18?
I don't. Maybe I might have overshot.
I think that was the total.
That's my fault. That's poor.
Hang on, I'll pull it up. I think that was 8.
That's poor preparation.
10 picks, and I think. Hang on, I think I know where you're getting that number from. Where is rushing on here? He had 10 picks and 6 fumbles, so it was 16 turnovers.
Okay, all right. Well, that was poor preparation on my part, but the main
be better. Take a lap.
Yeah, the main theme of it though is ball security and proving to me that you can be, not to me, but this is my point, proving that you can be a reliable game manager, right? Somebody that can keep the train on the tracks, keep it on schedule, not turn the football over, because ultimately I think it had to have driven Bill Belichick and Josh McDaniels absolutely crazy how much they turned the ball over last year. And they know, as they say, and they harp on it every single week, that ball security and limiting turnovers and taking the football away defensively is the quickest way to win or lose a football game. And for years, they dominated in terms of turnover differential. They need to get back there. So if Mac Jones can be a good game manager and he can dominate the details of the game, then I do think that he is going to have a real chance to win this job.
Yeah, you're at a third. Oh, no, you just had two, right? Those are your two
just
points?
Two.
So I don't disagree with anything you just said. I think that all of those are things that Mac Jones needs to do. That being said, I don't think he can win the job because I think the cards are stacked against him because he is a rookie. I'm not saying he's not good enough to play. I am a noted Mac Jones enthusiast. I'm not saying he'll never play, but Bill Belichick is not going to start a rookie quarterback week one. I truly just don't believe that. The way he's treated rookies at other positions, he wants guys to sit. He wants guys to learn. And this is the most cerebral position on the football field. He is going to see Cam Newton's 10 years of NFL experience as a huge, huge, huge factor in this decision. I think that whenever Mac Jones takes over, whether it be week 2, whether it be, at week 5 after the Bucs game, some people have pointed to that, whether it be 2022, whenever it is, it's going to be more about Cam Newton than Mac Jones. I don't think that there is a level that Mac Jones can play where he will get the starting job if Cam Newton is, as long as Cam Newton is serviceable. It's not about Mac Jones being good, right? It's not about Mac Jones being so good. Cam Newton also has to drop far enough where he is becoming a significant hindrance to the team winning games. That could happen. But, I kind of felt that way at times last year that Cam Newton had hit that level and it was time for Jarrett Stidham and they still didn't bench him. So we don't know how low Cam needs to go for that to happen, but that's what it's about to me. Mac's not going to be the reason that Mac Jones starts games. If Mac Jones starts games this year, it will be because of Cam Newton.
Okay, so what do you say to this, though? Because I hear you on some of the rookie stuff, but if you go back and you believe sort of the tale, right? The story of the 2001 Patriots, it was that coming out of training camp, Bill Belichick was prepared to start Tom Brady over Drew Bledsoe, but Drew Bledsoe had just signed that big contract, and Drew Bledsoe was Drew Bledsoe at the time, and Brady was Brady, and the injury to Bledsoe opened the door for Brady, but Brady was Bill's guy, right? And Brady was just entering his second year in the league. He had not started a game. He might have started a game in 2000 towards the end of the season.
No, he threw 4 passes all in relief.
Right. So he had never started a game up until that point, and Belichick was prepared to go there because he felt like Brady was the better guy for that specific team. And that's what I wonder with a guy like Mac Jones is, do they look at this and they say, all right, we got better playmakers now. We still have a good downhill running game, even without the quarterback as a factor with their legs. We just need somebody to manage the game, get the ball out, put the ball in the spots that we need him to put the ball in. And Mac is just a better timing, rhythm-based thrower in that sense than Cam Newton. I keep on saying this over and over again, and I just keep on coming back to it. I just feel like Mac is such a better stylistic fit for what they're going to ask and what they want out of the quarterback position. And that is why, if my number 2 point, if Mac can prove that he can take care of the football, and he had some turnovers in minicamp, granted it was minicamp, but he did throw some interceptions in minicamp. But if he can take care of the football and he can be that game manager and just get the ball out to Jonnu and get the ball out to Hunter Henry and Nelson Aguilar and all these playmakers that they've added in the offseason, why can't it be Mac in terms of all the things that Mac does better than Cam stylistically, at least on paper?
It can. I'm not telling you it's logical. It can. What I'm saying is it would have made sense for Damian Harris to play as a rookie. They were backed up at running back. They needed him to play. It would have helped if N'Keal, I think, had played more as a rookie. And I know N'Keal's kind of a loaded topic right now, but they needed receivers that year. They couldn't find receivers, and still N'Keal couldn't get on the field. quarterback is a skill position. We have the tight ends last year. Devin Asiasi couldn't get on the field. Dalton Keene couldn't get on the field, despite the fact that Ryan Izzo showed he's not really an NFL tight end. At the skill positions, at the positions that handle the football, rookies, especially recently, have not been able to get on the field. I think that's only going to be exacerbated at the quarterback position. I don't see why he wouldn't play a rookie running back. He wouldn't play a rookie receiver. He wouldn't play a rookie tight end. But suddenly, as a quarterback, he's going to give that guy the keys. I don't like. My point is, there's been rookies in the past who would match what you said. They've been fits, and they were either healthy scratches or they were just sat. And look, I think some of that is valid. I don't hate their strategy of redshirting running backs. I don't hate the idea of redshirting Mac, even if he is maybe helps you win games. If sitting him for 8 weeks is going to make him be a better player over the next 10 years, I'm all for it. I'll take one more 500 season if it means you get the best out of Mac Jones for the next decade. I think most Patriots fans should take that trade-off. Some won't, because some of you people look very short-term and have no concept of the big picture, but you need to make sure these guys are ready so they're not, so that they can make the most of it when they get their opportunity. I think that's how Bill sees it at the other positions. I just believe, based on the context, sorry about that, that's going to carry over to quarterback. That's it. Again,
did your alarm just go off at 4:20, by the way?
Not for that. Yes, it did. That was a reminder that the dishwasher is done running. I forgot I said that. I tried to line it up so it's not during the show. But yeah. No, so yeah, to go back to the point, I can't give you a logical reason for this take. I can give you the historical context behind it. I can't give you a logical reason, but I just don't see all of these previous rookies didn't play. Now, the one exception is Sony Michel, Lawrence Maroney. First round picks, heavily involved. Mac Jones is a first round pick.
Get hurt, I feel like he would have been right in there. And Isaiah Wynn too. I feel like he might have played right away if he didn't get hurt.
I won't put. We're just talking skill position, because offensive line rookies they'll throw in, and those guys are generally very successful. For Michael Onwenu, going back. So
yeah,
that's a little different. But yeah, I just don't see. I don't see it right away. I'm not saying Mac can't start this year. I just don't see Bill going there right away. And by the way, if I'm wrong, fine. That would be great. I want the better quarterback to play.
I want the better quarterback to play too.
I'm just telling you what the historical context tells me.
I think we're going to go out there, and I have a really, based off of what we saw in minicamp and assuming that the momentum continues in that direction, I think we're going to be out there in training camp a weekend. We're going to be on the pod after the first full week of camp, and we're going to say, man, Mac looks good. Right, Mac looks good. Granted, Cam can still do a lot of things with his legs. The Cam Newton that we saw at minicamp was the same Cam Newton that we saw last year. It's the same player, right? I don't think he's gotten a loads better or worse or anything like that. I think he's the same guy. I think we're going to get out there at training camp and we're going to say, wow, Mac looks really good. And at some point in time, it's going to be difficult to keep him off the field when you did take him in the first round. The writing is clearly on the wall that Mac Jones is going to be the quarterback of the future. Cam Newton has come out and said it as much, that he knows that Mac Jones is the quarterback of the future here in New England. I don't know. I feel like at some point in time, you got to use your eyes. You got to go with your gut and realize that, wow, that this is going to be better for us moving forward if we go with Mac over Cam, and whether that's week 1 or it's week 4 or it's week 8, that remains to be seen. But those are the two things that I think that Mac can do in camp at least. And really,
you all right there?
Every time.
This is a very late in the week in July.
We are going off the rails now.
Do we? All right. I guess I'll fill here. Nope. Are you okay? You can clear your throat if you
need. We're good. We're good. Okay. There we go. Whew. Sorry, folks. Alex is setting alarms for 420s. My throat is shot. These things are coming up in the middle of July. We're working out the kinks. But Mac Jones, that's our 20 minutes on how Mac Jones can win the starting job. I want to flip over to N'Keal Harry now and discuss some of the things that we didn't necessarily discuss on Tuesday. We did a little bit. We did a little bit on Tuesday, but I want to get to a couple of these things. First of all, Jeremy Fowler, I mentioned this at the beginning of the show. he had the report out there that he asked some NFL executives. They said that they would give up a conditional 6th-round pick for N'Keal Harry right now in a trade. And what I am seeing in that is I would wait. If all you're going to get is a conditional 6th-round pick, I'm waiting to trade N'Keal Harry. I'm forcing him to come into training camp and compete because he wants to get traded. He wants to go where he wants to, he has places that he would prefer to go. The Patriots want to get the best value. So to me, it's in both sides' best interest for N'Keal Harry to come in here and actually compete and actually play well in training camp and in the preseason. And his value, if it's only a conditional 6th-round pick, then obviously his value is not very high right now. Maybe they can go out there in the 3 preseason games, showcase him a little bit against some 3rd or 4th string cornerbacks and pump up that value just a little bit. I just see it as a situation where it doesn't. And look, the statement that his agent put out didn't exactly behoove N'Keal Harry either. But I don't think that it behooves N'Keal Harry to go out and dog it in training camp and in the preseason, right? If he wants to get traded and he wants to kind of, turn his career around in general, going out there and not playing well and not giving it his all in training camp and in the preseason really doesn't do him any good. But if he goes out there and showcases himself a little bit, moves the needle a little bit on the compensation, then that maybe interests the Patriots in trading him. Secondly, you wait till the end of training camp to trade him. Maybe injuries happen elsewhere in the NFL and a team loses a couple of wide receivers in training camp or in the preseason to injuries, and they get a little bit more desperate to fill those roles. Maybe, at that point in time, a team looks at it and says, well, we want to trade or we want to cut this player that we kind of are giving up on. Well, let's swap players here, right? Like, Jakobi Brissett for Philip Dorsett type of deal, right? We're probably going to move on from these players or cut these players anyways. So all of these things I think point to his value only going up unless he gets injured. I just trading him now for a conditional 6th-round pick. Really the only thing you're gaining from that is that you don't have to pay his salary. Like that's literally the only thing that you're gaining, unless you truly believe that he's going to be a big time locker room distraction for the rest of the way.
Yeah, see, I would be worried about that. Not necessarily locker room distraction, but I mean, here's the flip side of that. Does he want to risk going out to camp and getting exposed? He's going to be going up against Stephon Gilmore. He's going to be going up against J.C. Jackson. I don't know after that statement if he's necessarily going to get any favors by this coaching staff.
Yeah.
So on the flip side, if I'm him, I want to be out, I want to be in camp day 1 with my new team so that I can learn the playbook, get acclimated, get the chemistry, and have a shot to make the roster. The other thing about trading N'Keal Harry for a player is I don't know that you're going to get a player for him that's a roster lock. And if you trade him for a player that you have to cut, well, then you gave him up for nothing. If you trade him for a pick, at least you have, an asset, whether it be next year, whether it be in 2 years, that you can use. You can use that asset to trade up. You can use that asset to trade back and accumulate more assets. Maybe you pick a player there and it's just, hey, we want another player in place of N'Keal Harry. We don't have room for that player on this year's roster. So let's trade that for a pick and we get to choose our own guy, and we'll do it in a year or two when maybe there's more room on the roster. So I've been saying this. I would go pick for pick, or I would go player for pick, even if it's a pick swap, and I would get him, make that trade as soon as possible. So you go into camp where he's not eating up reps. He's not discouraged. Because that's the other thing. You got new receivers on this roster. You've got Nelson Aguilar. You've got Kendrick Bourne. And then whether it's any of these other receivers, a guy like Isaiah Zuber, a guy like Trey Nixon, who's been here but maybe hasn't played a ton in the context of this offense, you want the guys who might actually play getting those reps instead of a guy isn't going to be a part of the team. So I would try to make this move as soon as possible. Get what you can for a pick. If it's a conditional 6, it's a conditional 6. I think that works, and you go from there.
So the reason why I totally understand why N'Keal Harry wants to get traded before camp, he wants to get into his new team, like you said, learn the playbook, all those things. I just don't. That trade compensation is so minimal for the Patriots that it just feels to me like they could eventually do better.
But I have to stop you here. No trade asset, no draft asset is minimal. a 6th round pick. When they take Onwenu, the 5th to 6th round, something like that. When did they take Jake Bailey? When did they
I
take,
think they can, my point is, I think they can do better. And to the point that you made about giving reps to him in practice, it's not necessarily about giving him reps in practice, because other teams are not necessarily scouting practice, right? Like, they're not going out there.
I don't know about that.
They have birdies, they have their ways of finding things out of who's playing well and stuff like that, but they're not out there watching. Whereas if you're in the preseason games, right, like, you might not want Nelson Aguilar or Kendrick Bourne to play a ton in the preseason, right? You might want to save those guys for the regular season. That's when you can throw N'Keal Harry in there and, quarter 3, quarter 4, second half of a preseason game, have him catch a couple of jump balls, let him get it, look good in those preseason games, and maybe he catches the eye of another team. Maybe he catches his eye if the Patriots hold joint practices with the Giants or something like that. Maybe he can catch an eye of Joe Judge at that point in time, who has worked with him a little bit his rookie season. So that to me is why, unless you really believe that he is going to be a locker room cancer, right, and he's going to be somebody that's going to pull the rest of the group down or inhibit the rest of the group, then maybe you move on from him right now. But if you feel like you can outlast it a little bit, and you can at least try to get a little bit more for it at the end of camp, because remember, again, you have teams that find out that other players on their roster are on the outside looking in once they get into these camp battles that might interest the Patriots. You have injuries that happen in training camp every single year. So maybe a team becomes a little bit more desperate to make a move for a wide receiver with some upside. It just feels to me like we're at rock bottom right now of his value. And maybe they can get a little bit more if they force N'Keal into camp and have him play in the preseason games and have him showcase himself a little bit, because it behooves both sides for him to showcase himself. The Patriots can get a little bit more in the compensation, and N'Keal can get moved a little bit faster.
I wouldn't risk it. I think that you don't go into camp with guys on your roster who don't serve a purpose. I'm not saying every guy has to have a chance to make the team, but, tell me why N'Keal Harry, why it's so important the Patriots keep N'Keal Harry on the 90-man roster for football reasons, not trying to raise his stock for football reasons. And that's what gets me. Whether a guy has a chance to make the roster, whether he's somebody who's developmental, who you believe you can get onto the practice squad and work with in a 2-3 year window, even if it's just a guy where, hey, we only have 9 offensive linemen that have a shot to make this team, but in order to run some of these drills, we need 12. So we're going to bring in some offensive linemen. Like, it can be a reason as simple as that. I don't know that N'Keal Harry checks any of those boxes. If you're keeping him just to raise his stock, I'd rather have somebody else who's going to come in and in one way or another, whether it's by forcing other players to compete, whatever it is, I would rather have somebody who helps make this a better football team in the 1, 2 to 3 year window. I don't think having N'Keal Harry in camp, knowing he wants to leave, necessarily does that.
All right, well, fair enough. I'm just looking at it from improving the stock in terms of the trade compensation, because you see that conditional 6th round pick, it's probably based on him making the roster or playing a certain amount of snaps. Right. It just, that's really a tough pill to swallow.
But so how is that any different than you get a player who you're going to end up cutting anyway?
I don't know if you're going to end up cutting.
There's a real chance you end up. There's a real chance you end up with nothing, one way or the other.
If you trade for a guy, though, at the end of training camp that's getting cut off another roster, but you see a role for him here, then you probably see a role for that player here, right? If you're going to make that trade at that point, I keep on going back to the Jakobi for Philip Dorsett trade, right? Like, right. They saw the Colts were basically done with Philip Dorsett. They had enough. They wanted to move on, and they got something back in return that the Patriots had to kind of was a little bit of extra baggage that they didn't necessarily need, right? Need to trim the fat there at the quarterback position, and both sides won in some respect.
I guess and I'm normally somebody who's, don't sell low, like the Andrew Benintendi trade. I wasn't a huge fan of them trading him when they did, but with N'Keal, I don't think he has that kind of value. I don't think with a couple preseason games, he's going to get to that kind of value, especially since in 2019, he played well in the preseason. He's shown he can play well in the preseason. So teams kind of know that. Again, if it's between getting a borderline player there, or if they trade him now for a pick and they sign, say, a veteran corner, whether it's Trey Kirkpatrick, Richard Sherman, whoever, I don't know that that's the route they'd go. But let's say that spot goes to a veteran corner who's going to push Juwan Williams or Michael Jackson. I think that makes them a better team right now. I would rather be a better team going into camp and be more prepared going into camp than hoping that some team has wide receiver injuries and gets desperate, and hoping that N'Keal has a good training camp, and hoping N'Keal has a good preseason and upping the value there. I think you can get something for him now. You do it. You find a way to use that last roster spot to improve the team for training camp, and you go from there.
Fair enough. All right. The other question I wanted to bring up with N'Keal Harry is something that I was debating with a couple of people on Twitter about earlier. And I feel like this is sort of like a chicken or the egg thing, right? But I want to present this question, and you can't say it's a little bit of both, Alex. You have to give an answer of which one matters.
It's going to be both. I think I know what question
it's going to be both, but no copping out, all right? I'm going to hold you to taking a side here. Is it the Patriots? Are the Patriots' issues drafting wide receivers? Well, let's not get into if they really have an issue with that or not, but just in general, the narrative is the Patriots' issues drafting wide receivers a system problem or an evaluation problem? I know you're going to say it's a little bit of both, but I want you to pick a side. Which one do you feel it is more to blame? The system is too complicated. The system doesn't, lend itself to college receivers coming here and developing well, or their evaluations are off on the prospects.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me, were N'Keal's issues more of an issue of the Patriots or him? Because that one's more complicated. And that's a fun question. Maybe we do that next.
It's kind of what we're asking here in a sense, but maybe a little bit different. Yeah.
So I don't go both ways on this one. It's the system. I've talked about this before. The Patriots system is somewhat archaic. I don't want to say archaic because that is a negative connotation, right? But it's a little bit, they're still kind of doing what they did 10, 15 years ago, and they've had the same coaching staff for so long. There maybe hasn't been that push for them to revolutionize the offense, but they're still doing a lot of the same things they did 10, 15 years ago, where in the last 7 to 10 years, college football offensively has undergone a major revolution. And what teams are doing in college to then jump to the NFL, especially the Patriots system, it's like playing a completely different sport, what these players are being asked to do. So I think they could do a better job of bringing in guys who are better fits for the system, certainly. And I think N'Keal's a case of that. But I don't know that there is such a thing as a Patriots system fit wide receiver coming right out of college. Maybe after a guy's been in the year or two, sure, that exists. But at least in, Power 5 college football, maybe if you go to one of these, real old school offenses in the Big Ten, like Iowa or Wisconsin, you can find somebody who would have, that experience in that kind of concept. But those schools aren't getting top flight wide receivers, or at least they haven't in the last couple of years. Iowa had a good tight end, they had Fant, right? Is an Iowa guy. Yes. So, not entirely, but yeah, I just, there's no Patriots fits in the draft because their offense is such a departure from what college offenses run. And it's not a simple fix either. It's maybe a little easier now that Tom Brady's not here, but it's not a simple fix. So yeah, I would say it's the system. And I said this on Tuesday, and I said it last week. The Patriots process for acquiring top flight wide receivers from this point forward under Josh McDaniels should be free agency or in trades. It shouldn't be the draft. At least not high. If you want to take late day 3 flyers on guys like Trey Nixon, sure, go for it. I'm much more comfortable paying a guy $10 to $20 million a year who can play receiver at the NFL level than asking a guy to come from, one of these spread college offenses and trying to learn what the Patriots are doing.
So I kind of feel I lean towards the other way. I think it is evaluation. And the reason why I feel like it is evaluation is because the Patriots, and look, it's a very small sample size, but the 3 receivers other than Deion Branch, which was a lifetime ago at this point, it feels like, right?
So at that point, what colleges were doing was very similar to what the Patriots were doing.
So what I feel like the prototype for early round receiver, if the Patriots are going to draft a receiver in the first 2 rounds, they have leaned in the 3 times that we can really sink our teeth into these big, explosive, outside weapons in the mold of a N'Keal Harry and Aaron Dobson, even if you want to go all the way back to Chad Jackson, right? Those are the types of receivers they've leaned towards. And those types of guys just simply do not fit the system that they run, which has been extremely productive. And granted, it did have Tom Brady quarterbacking it. I get all that. But still, it has been very productive. And there has been a lot of players, whether it be Julian Edelman, a Deion Branch, guys that they've gotten in free agency, Rob Gronkowski was obviously a Patriots draft pick. He was a tight end, but he was still a receiver, and he panned out really well here. Guys that cut the ball out of the backfield, James White, Shane Vereen, all these guys were able to grasp the system. Why? Because what they did fit really well with what the Patriots do. Right. And to me, drafting a guy like a N'Keal Harry, who is 6'3", 225 pounds, wins uncontested catches, but can't run a route for a lick, right? That is a very bad route runner and very unrefined route runner, especially in his route breaks at the top of the route, just was never going to translate well here. So to me, what they need to do is change up their evaluation process to say, this is what we do offensively. We are a team that predicates smart timing, anticipatory route runners, guys that understand how to read out coverages, guys that understand how to get open, guys that have good separation skills. And we need to start going towards more of those guys and going towards the guys that actually fit what we do here than necessarily drafting the N'Keal Harry types or the Aaron Dobson types. And I do think that those types of players exist. Like in that draft with N'Keal Harry in 2019, Deebo Samuel, Terry McLaurin, if you want to wait to the 5th round and draft Hunter Renfrow from Clemson, those guys existed in that draft. Last year, this past year, we talk a lot about Kadarius Toney as a fit for the Patriots, as somebody that does those sort of things. I know he went one pick before the Patriots were on the clock, but if the Pats were able to leapfrog Minnesota, they could have had Justin Jefferson here, who is another guy that does a lot of those things. So I do think some of those guys exist. You just have to go out there and target those types of players. And to me, that needs to be item number one on their list for wide receiver evaluation moving forward. Is this is what we do with our wide receivers. This is what we're going to ask of our wide receivers. Now we need to find the bucket of guys that do those sorts of things, right? Because where's in the Patriots offense for the last 20 years, Alex, where's the back shoulder, jump ball, high point fade? Where is that guy, right? I guess like you could maybe say it was Gronk, but Gronk did so many other things that it just seems like that's a poor one to use. But where is that? Where is the N'Keal Harry in the history of the Patriots? It's few and far between.
So what that role has been, the closest thing to that role, I think, has been the run a 12-yard out. We're going to throw the ball 2 yards over the out of bounds on the sideline. You're going to reach over, grab it, toe tap. And that was Malcolm Mitchell. That was Brandon LaFell. Those are the main. Yeah. Brandon Lloyd, right, is the third one. There were 3 guys in a row, and they really haven't had a guy to do that since then. And I thought maybe that would be N'Keal Harry. It wasn't. The only, and I do agree with what you said. I think they need to look more at guys that fit. Where I think the N'Keal Harry pick came from is I think he didn't fit, and I think that's why they took him. I think the idea was we have Julian Edelman, right? We have, we have all these guys who fit this mold, but we don't want to be, a one-tune band on offense. We want to be able to do a number of things. Yeah. So that's where I would flip the question. I think it's very easy to say, just go pick receivers who all fit the same mold that can succeed here. And that's all well and good. And I think there is something to be said for that. But if you have 5 of the same wide receiver, you're not very multidimensional on offense, and that's going to create a problem. So what do the Patriots do when they want to go get that 6'4" jump ball wide receiver? I think they did it this offseason. They paid Hunter Henry. They paid Nelson Aguilar. That's how you do it. I'm not worried about them drafting these intermediate over-the-middle receivers because they have done that. They haven't been great at it, but whether it's through the draft or other ways, they've found those guys. They've either taken them in the draft, gotten them undrafted, or pulled them off teams where they weren't being used properly. They can find the Jakobi Meyers, the Julian Edelmans, the Danny Amendolas, the Philip Dorsetts. They can find those guys. It's how do they replicate that big receiver who's going to be a height issue, a size matchup issue for teams. They were missing that guy. They thought N'Keal would be that guy. He wouldn't. Now I think the idea is Hunter Henry will be that guy because it really was Gronk, right? Yeah. If you remember the night they picked N'Keal, we were all talking about him as being Rob Gronkowski's replacement. Yeah. That was the conversation. He is going to have the role that Gronk did in being a size mismatch. That didn't happen. Those are the guys they've struggled to draft. I think in the draft, they need to stick to those intermediate over the middle guys, stick to the Brandon Lloyd, Malcolm Mitchell role, because they do seem to have a knack to identify those guys. But when you want to go get that big body, just pay them.
And I do think that that's a big reason why you saw them pass as much as it looks bad in hindsight. I think a big reason why you saw them pass on guys like Debo or McLaurin, or even later on like a guy like Renfro, is because they had all these inside receivers.
Right. They wanted the X.
They wanted the X, and the only true X's in that draft were N'Keal and DK. Right. And
well, I think some of it too, because N'Keal had slot experience. And I think the idea was he was a true X, but at the same time, there was a little bit of comfort there for them with the other things he could do. But yeah, and look, I don't fault them for passing on DK Metcalf. He went to the second round. Every team passed on him. There were red flags. He's since proven those red flags wrong, and good for him. And
he had a big, extensive injury history. He had obviously route running red flags, and all the things that we see with N'Keal Harry. A lot of people thought was going to be DK Metcalf instead, and it ended up being N'Keal that was the problem.
But we're talking about the Patriots' inability to develop wide receivers. Is DK Metcalf a 1,300-yard receiver in New England? No,
I don't. Probably not.
I don't know that he's requesting a trade 2 years in, but I don't think he becomes a household name in New England like he has in Seattle. And if you flip him, and if N'Keal gets drafted by Seattle, I don't know that he's a 13-yard receiver, but he's certainly not asking out 2 years in. I think he's a serviceable player.
Right.
So I even don't fault them for AJ Brown to an extent. It sucks. He would have been a fit. He was a Pats fan, so that was fun. The one from that draft that kills me and will always kill me is Terry McLaurin, because he was the safe pick. He does everything they like. He was a Patriot to a T. They could have doubled down. They could have taken him and N'Keal. That was the pick. If you want to get mad about a pick from 2019, DK and AJ Brown, you're being capped in hindsight at that point. You are using the benefit of what we know now projected on the past. Terry McLaurin at the time was the right pick. That's the one to get upset about.
4-down player too. A guy that down at the Senior Bowl just was killing people as a gunner on punt team also. So I really thought that he was going to be a Patriot, a guy that ran great routes, really precise in his route breaks, really efficient at the top, played on special teams. I don't know. I felt like that was going to be a guy that they were going to take. They took N'Keal Harry. Again, the problem, back to the original question of system versus evaluation, it's obviously a little bit of both, right? They both kind of go hand in hand.
I would say I would put a third one in there. It's system, it's evaluation, it's development. Yeah. I think development is a big part of that as well. Because remember, was it Nick Caserio was the wide receivers coach N'Keal's first year here, or was it Lombardi?
It was Joe Judge.
Joe Judge, right. They never, N'Keal's first year, they didn't have a full-time wide receivers coach. It was Joe Judge, who was the special teams coordinator. If you're going to take a wide receiver in the first round, and I know Troy Brown was around, and that certainly helps, but you should have a dedicated wide receivers coach if you're going to take a wide receiver in the first
round. A whole nother rant
that
I could go on.
I think you have to consider development as well.
The way that they coach wide receivers here, and look, I'm not going to sit here and say that I know better than Bill Belichick about how to coach a football team, right? I mean, clearly that's not the case. But the way that they coach wide receivers here is clearly behind the way the rest of the league coach wide receivers. And I think a big part of it is that they're not as focused on developing route releases, breaks, technique, all this kind of stuff, because they are looking so big picture at certain things, right? Like they want their guys to fit into the entire puzzle of the 11 guys on the team rather than just are on the field, and rather than just focusing on all those little minor details where we're so used to the Patriots being detail oriented. It feels like their wide receivers play hard, they block well, they do some of these bigger picture types of things that might help the offense as a whole, but they don't necessarily do those little minute details that we see that kind of create a lot more separation and a lot more sort of refined route running. So I definitely think that they could use an overhaul with how they coach wide receivers here and get somebody in here that really is going to drill footwork, that really is going to drill technique and know how to do those types of things. But back to just quickly the system versus the evaluation thing, I have a really tough time with throwing out a system that's 20 years in the making just to fit wide receivers. You know what I mean? Like, I have a tough time saying, like, they should just throw that playbook in the trash because the college game is the way that it is, and the wide receivers from the college game are what they are. And no, there are guys that exist in the college game, I think, that you can find. It's about finding those players more of the time and stop chasing the N'Keal Harrys and the Aaron Dobsons and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, stop chasing those types of guys and go after guys that you know are going to work here.
Right. And I think there are still wide receivers who can have success in the system, but I think being elsewhere in the NFL first as a transition helps. So it's not that they can't run the system. It's just not kind to rookies.
Yeah. All right. Last point here about the wide receivers I wanted to make. I've seen this floated around a little bit on Twitter as well. And that is, are we underrating Jakobi Meyers a little bit? Because all this talk about N'Keal Harry and how he was a bust and how he wants out, and I understand that's the headline right now. But in that same rookie class, as an undrafted guy, they signed Jakobi Meyers, right? He's been everything. If N'Keal Harry was doing what Jakobi Meyers is doing production wise, we'd be stoked, right? We'd be like, oh, they found a guy right in the first round. They got their wide receiver. Jakobi Meyers last year was on pace to have over 1,000 yards. If you stretch out that 12 game stretch that he had, starting with that San Francisco game, he was a 1,000-yard wide receiver down in the second half of the year. Now, I do think some of those stats are slightly inflated in sort of like a good stats, bad team sort of way, right? Where he was the only guy getting open. He was the only guy demanding targets, and they had to force feed him because he's all they had, right? It's sort of like a basketball team when a guy averages 25 points per game because nobody else can score, right? You got to chuck up 40 shots, so somebody's going to average 20 a game. But at the same time, do you think that we are sleeping a little bit on Jakobi Meyers and his ability to be, I don't know if I would call him a number one wide receiver, but at least a very good NFL wide receiver?
Yeah, I would say so. I saw people kind of coming at me in the chat the other day for saying, if you add Andy Isabella or you add Jamison Crowder to this team, what are you really adding? And that's why they're saying, you have a bunch of number twos. Okay, those guys, I'll take Jakobi Meyers over either of those guys. Jakobi Meyers, who knows the system, who's been in the system, who is young, who has team control. I'll take him over those guys any day. Again, the Patriots needing a receiver is more of a meme than it is reality at this point. They added the 2 tight ends. Look at where Meyers is on the depth chart. He's where he should be. If anything, he's probably, a little bit underslotted. So I think he's a guy who is probably in the role he should be in for this team. I don't think that upgrading him or being in a rush to replace him should be high on the to-do list. I don't think it's something they need to worry about. I absolutely think that Jakobi Meyers, for the role he's going to play, is going to be fine. He's not their number one wide receiver. He's not. Hunter Henry is their number one wide receiver. Jonnu Smith is there, or I guess however you want to do it with Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith. I just see
1A, 1B.
Right. Yeah. We don't know exactly who's going to be the Hunter Henry's going to be their number one receiver in terms of yards. I think Jonnu Smith's going to be their number one receiver in terms of catches. Then you have Nelson Aguilar, who's going to be kind of the intermediate guy. And then you get to Jakobi Meyers. And he's even battling with Kendrick Bourne. So that's right about where he should be. You're not going to add a wide receiver who's going to usurp him at this point. It's going to cost too much to do it if you really want to. I think where Jakobi Meyers is right now, the role they have him in, based on what we saw last year, is perfect. He's going to thrive in that role. He's going to be a contributor. I think that, I think that people's, using that as, we have Jakobi Meyers as our second wide receiver, using that as a way to knock this offense. I think you're off base. You're not looking at it with the full picture. If you're running it back with Ryan Izzo again, then that's more of a conversation, but you're not. So.
Right. I think the biggest issue that you have with Jakobi Meyers and why people don't get more on board with him is speed, right? I mean, he's just not he's not a fast wide receiver.
They've never been predicated on straight line speed at the wide receiver position, though.
Other than like Cooks and like Randy Moss, right? Those are the only two guys you can think of that really won on straight line speed.
Right. Outside of Moss and Cooks, they generally have one guy, whether it be Philip Dorsett or Damiere Byrd, who's just going to run up the field and keep the opposing defense honest. Everybody else, it's more about small space quickness instead of straight line speed.
Yeah, and Jakobi's got that. He's got great ability to set up routes, set up his breaks, understands leverage, understands how to attack coverage, really good against man coverage last year, and just overall was a very smooth wideout and a very efficient wideout. Every single time he was targeted out of all the receivers last year, the Patriots against man coverage, he's the only guy that even came close to having good numbers, right? And he had good numbers. Everybody else was towards the bottom of the barrel. So I do think to some degree we are sleeping on Jakobi Meyers a little bit, but I don't know if I don't know what his ceiling is if in terms of can he get any better than he already is now. Maybe he can, and maybe I'm underselling him a little bit in that respect. But I don't know how much better we are going to see Jakobi Meyers get because of his physical limitations, right? Because he's not a 4-3 guy. He's not somebody that is super fast. So I think this is as good as he might get, but I think that is still a really good wide receiver.
That's a solid third receiver. So let me just throw these numbers out here real quick. So obviously Jakobi didn't really play a ton at the beginning of last season. He had 1 catch over the first 5 games. He was a healthy scratch for 2 of them. Once he started playing regularly against San Francisco in week 6, so over the last 10 games of the year, his 16-game average, so if he had done that pace for full season, 84 catches, 1,000 yards.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. If they can get him to do that as the second receiver, they're golden.
Yeah. All he does is get open and catch the football, but he doesn't do it. He does it in a flashy-ish way, but he doesn't do it in the flashiest of ways, right? He's not Tyreek Hill. He's not one of those types of guys, but he is somebody that I think is sort of getting underrated in this conversation just a little bit as well. And I see in the chat some love for Kendrick Bourne too. I think both of those guys, along with Aguilar, come together and are pretty solid top 3. Are they the best top 3 in the NFL? No, but I think they're a lot better than what we're currently giving them credit for.
Yeah, and they're a lot better than they were last year. People are acting like this offense didn't improve from last year. I don't know where that's coming from. They absolutely did. It's night and day compared to what they were last season. They're going to be a better team.
Well, all right. Maybe we're just a bunch of homers and we think the Patriots wide receivers are a little bit better than everybody else. But I really don't. I don't feel it. I feel like I really feel like people are going crazy about this topic, and because they don't have somebody that they're going to draft in the first round in your fantasy football draft, or they don't have somebody that's a 99 in Madden, or something like that, we feel like the Patriots wide receivers are garbage. And I don't know. I feel like that's going a little bit too far.
Yeah, I mean, I said this. What was it? Weeks ago, I blew up about this. That you can't. It's the fantasy football has poisoned the common football fan. They absolutely have. And the 2 letters next to a player's name on the roster denoting position, you can't look at that in a vacuum. You got to look at the pass catchers as a whole, and you've got to look at the offense in a whole. The other thing that is going to make this passing game work, they couldn't capitalize on it much last year. The running game is going to be so freaking good with this team this year. They're going to be able to run the hell out of the ball. They're going to have a better defense. They're going to be able to hold more leads. That's just going to open things up in the passing game. It's going to force defenses to play more aggressive. It's going to force defenses to put more guys in the box. The other moves they made, bringing back Trent Brown, improving the defense, all of that they did is going to make it easier to throw the football, because complementary football, because teams will have to play them more aggressively, because they have to actually worry about, there's going to be close games. You're not going to get down, whatever it was, 24-3 to San Francisco at the half, whatever that is. You're going to be in more competitive games. You're going to be able to stop the run. You're going to be able to run the football yourself. It's all going to be complementary.
And what I think is great about Jonnu Smith, who I was writing about today for my most important Patriots series, is his versatility kind of allows them to blur the lines between formations, right? Like in personnel grouping. So because he's on the field, they can line up in like a true 12 personnel set with 2 tight ends. And that's what it will technically be, right? When you write down what formation they're in, it will be 12. But really, because he can play off the line of scrimmage, because he can play detached from the formation, all these sorts of things, and Hunter Henry too, to a degree, maybe not in the backfield, but detached from the formation, they can basically be 12, 21, or 11 if they want to be, or 10, sort of, right? Like they can be all of these things all at once. And if you're the opposing defense, on top of the fact that they can still run it over with you in that formation, in that grouping, how do you match it? Right? Like what are teams going to sit here and say, how are we going to match this? Because the Patriots with these tight ends, they can be 21 personnel with Jonnu Smith as a fullback, and they can run over us like that if we play them in dime. But if we play them in base or we play them in nickel, worrying about the run, now they're going to go 5 wide on us, and they're going to have, these tight ends detached from the formation and moving around. That I think is going to be a whole lot of fun. And what Josh McDaniels, I'm sure, is cooking up in the lab already is this ability ability to morph and blur those lines in the same grouping. So you can run the same 5 guys out there and do it in 6 different ways. Right. And that I think is going to be very difficult to stop. But on top, because a lot of football, we talk about personnel, we talk about talent, all that kind of stuff. But a big part of scheming offense is formations. Right. Yes. And if you can continue to change up formations and kind of say, well, this is sort of 11, but it's kind of 12, but it's a little bit of 21. Those types of things can get really confusing for defenses and how to match stuff.
Yeah. A lot of teams, it's based on running the offense. This is a little bit of an oversimplification, Evan. So this is going to drive you crazy. But a lot of NFL offenses are based on running a lot of different plays out of very few formations. The Patriots offense, when it's at its best, is running a handful of plays out of a number of various formations and looks. They might have the same play that schematically is the same thing, but they'll run it with 4 or 5 personnel groupings, and each of those groupings are aligned in 2 or 3 different ways. That's the Patriots offense when it's at its best. That was the Patriots in 2007. That was the Patriots in 2016, 2017. That, they have the personnel to do that again. I think that's another big thing we're not talking about, Evan, especially after Julian Edelman got hurt last year, right, and was out. Who was the matchup wild card? Who was the guy that was going to keep defensive coordinators up at night? Not just because he was good, but because it's difficult to figure out how you want to deal with him. Who was the guy that was, are we going to single him? Are we going to double him? Are we going to cover him with a corner, with a safety or a linebacker? They didn't have that guy. It was supposed to be James White. He had a bit of a down year, which is unfortunate, but it was pretty vanilla across the board. Their whole offense was pretty vanilla. Now they have Jonnu Smith, who is going to be that guy where how do you cover him? How do you, as a defense, dictate your personnel around him?
How do line up around the formation?
Right. And then and I think, by the way, I think Kendrick Bourne can kind of be like that too, in a more limited way. But I think, he's a guy who might get some of those looks when he's on the field. So they just have a lot more flexibility offensively, to go back to what I was saying at the beginning. And again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if that frustrated you with the oversimplicity of it. No. But they have more options on offense now from a play calling point of view, and that's a big deal. That's going to change things.
And that's how you get matchups, right? Because like I said, going back to that, do you put nickel out on the field? Do you put base out on the field? Because they're going to be able to run the football effectively with those 2 tight ends on the field. You do all these types of things. Well, now all of a sudden, McDaniels takes Jonnu Smith from the backfield, motions him out into the slot, and now he's got a linebacker over him, or now he's got a safety over him, and now he's got a mismatch, right? And that's how you create those types of mismatches across the formation, is by being able to do multiple things well out of the same personnel grouping that has a ton of flexibility in terms of what different versatility in terms of what guys can do. So that's where the Patriots, I think, can really get into sort of the chess game of all of this with the new weapons that they have, even if maybe those weapons in a vacuum aren't individually as good as some people would want them to be. Like Hunter Henry is not Travis Kelce, right? And Jonnu Smith is not George Kittle. But just because they're not individually that good, as a whole, they can really start to do things, a lot of confusing things. And that, I think, is going to make defenses on their heels. It's going to keep defensive coordinators some long nights, preparing for this Patriots offense, trying to figure out what's the best grouping to be in, what's the best personnel to put out on the field, what's the best way to defend these guys. I think that is going to be difficult for opposing defenses. All right, Alex and I are going to be back on the podcast next week on Tuesday. We're going to start previewing in training camp. Believe it or not, we are only a couple of weeks away from Patriots training camp, I believe.
I think it's 3 weeks from today, right? Is it the 28th or 29th?
So I think today is 3 weeks from today is the first official practice of camp, right? Because the veterans have to report the day before the first official practice of training camp. So I think the veterans report the 26th of the 27th.
No, it's 3 weeks from yesterday. It's the 28th is the first practice.
There we go. So 3 weeks from yesterday, it's coming up a lot faster.
Summer's almost over, Evan.
A lot faster than you think. It felt like we had a lot more time, but we definitely didn't. So we are going to be back on Tuesday to start talking about the training camp preview type of portion of the podcast. We'll look at offense and we'll look at defense. We'll get into some special teams too, I am sure. We'll do some Q&As as well between now and the start of camp too. But signing off for Alex Barth, I'm Evan Lazar. Thanks for watching, everybody.